So, hello, everybody. My name is Mark Dunley, and I'm the secretary of the EcoAction Committee of the Green Party United States. And thank you for joining our webinar on nuclear as a false climate solution. We have a wonderful lineup of speakers. In the order they'll be presenting, I'll give a little bit more of the background when they start. Tim Judson, who's executive director of the Nuclear Information and Resource Service. He's going to talk more about a national overview. Ann Rabe is with Don't Waste New York. We're talking about the unfortunate incident that our governor and others are really beginning to promote nuclear power in New York State. And then we're going to end up with Elizabeth Beecher from out in New Mexico, who's also a tribal member of Laguna Pueblo, as well as with Oglala Lakota and Kickapoo. Before we start, sort of sad news is that one of our other co-chairs, Professor David Schwartzman, recently passed on. David had been a professor at Howard University, quite active on the climate issue, both here in the United States, also part of the Global Greens network. And his son actually is a mayor out in Illinois in a little college town, have a joint website as well as a number of books, solarutopia.org. David had been a frequent candidate for the D.C. statehood Green Party for city council in D.C. and was very active in the overall eco-socialist movement. But the reason we decided to do this webinar, I mean, the Green Party, like many other groups, have been long opposed to nuclear power. Unfortunately, in recent years, there's been a new renaissance on the issue of nuclear power. Sort of the same corporate salesman, which I first encountered when I started opposing nuclear power back in the early 70s when a student at RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York, are peddling the same, industry sales pitch. We remain opposed to it because there are many environmental issues, the concern about radioactive waste, how long you have to store it. I'll leave it to our speakers to go into more details about that. But also the cost. It's always been the most expensive form of a way to produce electricity. And in terms of climate, besides it's not really being carbon free, we also have the problem that it takes so long to bring online that if we want to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees centigrade, it will not come online in time enough to deal with that problem. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Tim Judson. As I mentioned, he's executive director of the Nuclear Information and Resource Services. They serve as an information and networking hub for people and organizations concerned about nuclear power, radioactive waste, radiation, and sustainable energy issues since 1978. And Tim leads NER's work on nuclear reactor and climate change issues and has written a series of reports on nuclear. And let me highlight Tim. So, take it away, Tim.
Great. Well, thanks, Mark, and thanks for having me, and thanks for the invitation, and thanks to everyone else for being here tonight. And as Mark said, I'm the executive director of NERS. We're a small national organization that works to be sort of a resource for impacted communities and grassroots organizations that are concerned about nuclear energy. I myself, came to NERS having been a grassroots activist where I started doing this work, about 28 years ago, where I live on Onondaga Nation land in the city of Syracuse. And I live 30 miles downwind from three nuclear reactors that are on the shore of Lake Ontario. And that's really, why I got into this to begin with and really what keeps me going. And so I'm going to sort of give an overview of the issues and probably a reminder for most folks rather than news about why nuclear, power isn't a solution to the climate crisis or any other issue that we have. Um, but so I'll just kind of jump into it. All right. So, basic question, can we nuke the climate? And the reality and the answer is no. The nuclear power is not a solution to climate change. And that's for a bunch of basic reasons. It's too dirty, too dangerous, too expensive, and too slow. And it is, the nuclear industry is fundamentally rooted in environmental racism and human rights violations, including targeting indigenous nations and their lands for contamination and extraction, to communities of color for contamination and radioactive waste dumping, and inherent gender discrimination and intergenerational harm from the environmental pollutants that it produces. And so, what you have to realize is that, we thought we focused on thinking about nuclear power plants, but nuclear power plants are just, kind of the center point in a huge nuclear fuel chain that begins with the mining of uranium, and its processing and refinement into uranium ore, its enrichment into nuclear fuel, and then the production of a whole another wide array of radioactive wastes that eventually get either just sort of released into the environment or were transported and dumped into other communities. And this produces tremendous harm to communities all along that fuel chain. Um, Starting with the mining of uranium and the immense amount of contamination that happens as a result of that. You can see, on the front end, we have, in order to produce 1 pound of nuclear fuel for a reactor, you've already produced over 5,000 pounds of radioactive waste through the mining and the enrichment of that uranium. And then at the end of it, all of that nuclear fuel becomes over 100 million times more radioactive than when it went into a reactor. And it's toxic and dangerous to human health, the environment, for over 1 million years after that. And so this is an abominable environmental problem that we have created that still has no solution. There is no solution for radioactive waste, and that's just the reality of it. But in the process, we've also done things, like created 15,000 abandoned uranium mines. That's more abandoned uranium mines than we have McDonald's restaurants in this country. Um, and a lot of those places are as contaminated as the evacuation zone of Chernobyl. Um, and then we have, the production of, through the enrichment process, there's 7 to 8 times more depleted uranium that's created that it also still has not been dealt with than there is of the enriched uranium that's then sent to reactors. The reactors themselves, by splitting atoms, create a wide array of other radioactive wastes that are some of which is released directly into the air and the water around the nuclear power plant. Some of the rest of it is shipped off to other places for disposal. There's also whole side industries, like nuclear laundries that launder the contaminated uniforms that the workers wear that then contaminates those communities. And then at the end of the process, when the reactor is retired, that entire site has become radioactive waste. All the buildings, a lot of the soil, the water, the groundwater contamination, all has to be cleaned up or quote cleaned up through decommissioning, which generally costs more than $1 billion per reactor. And then you have, at the very end of all that, what to do with the irradiated nuclear fuel, which again is, for which there's no solution, there's no permanent management, system for it, and it is going to be hazardous for 1 million years. This is sort of a map of what, some of the harms from the plants where I live look like, and you could do a map like this for basically any nuclear facility in the country. But sort of as an overview of where we are today, So we have basically the oldest fleet of nuclear power plants in the world. The average age of reactors as of this month is almost 44 years in the U.S. And that's in part because nuclear power plants were so expensive and difficult and to build when they built most of them in the 70s and 80s, that they stopped building them because it was just a waste of time and money. And so now we have a bunch of reactors that are only getting older, and it's too expensive and difficult to build new ones. And so the fleet is aging, and the industry doesn't have anything to do but try to keep these old rusty buckets going. But to give you a sense of what that looked like, as a reminder, we've can't with about half the reactors that were proposed in the U.S. Originally in the 50s, 60s, and 70s were canceled. Those that were built ended up costing an average of over three times what their proposed costs were. And by the end of, and they took longer and longer to build. It didn't get easier to build reactors as they built more of them. And in fact, the last ones averaged 14 years construction times. That led to this pause in reactor construction in the US that basically was, the beginning of the demise of the industry as reactors were closing, and no more were being built. And that's sort of where we got to today. But the industry saw this coming 20 years ago when they got in President George W. Bush's big energy bill for the first time direct federal subsidies and financing for nuclear power plants. And there were, tens of billions of dollars on offer from the federal government to try to queue up what they called a nuclear renaissance, which turned out to be anything but, because even though utilities lined up to order, 30 new reactors, within a couple of years after that, they all applied for licenses from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. 16 of them basically canceled those applications because the costs were already soaring. But 14 reactors got licensed. Only four began construction, and those four reactors bankrupted Westinghouse by their cost overruns. So in the end, there's a 93% cancellation rate of what they called a nuclear renaissance. And the reactors that were built ended up costing $36 billion dollars. And the ratepayers of Georgia have seen their largest ever rate increase with a 24% rate increase. So people are, basically, having their power shut off because they can't afford to pay for a nuclear power plant.
2 minutes left, Tim.
Thanks. So you might have heard a lot about advanced nuclear reactors, and there's some detail here, but I'll sort of, kind of skip over some of this. The reality is that, advanced reactors are not inherently more safe. They're not inherently more affordable than the ones that we've already got. It's just that, the failure of the nuclear renaissance proved that even the conventional reactors that we've been familiar with weren't going to work out. And so now the industry is trying to recycle old ideas that didn't prove viable 40 years ago. But one of the things to keep in mind is that these reactors will actually produce more nuclear waste per amount of energy than the current reactors do. In fact, there was a study out of Stanford a few years ago that estimates that they will produce 2 to 30 times more radioactive waste than the current types of reactors that we have. So it will actually make the environmental problems from nuclear energy worse. The costs are already soaring. What you see in this graph is the costs, the costs of the reactors that were built in Georgia when they started construction and when they finished construction. And what you see now is that these small modular reactors that you might have heard a lot about already cost way, way, way more than what the projected cost of the new reactors in Georgia were expected to cost when they started construction. So we're already looking at SMRs, these small modular reactors, that are going to be way more expensive than the large reactors that we're familiar with. So to kind of close out, there are some basic laws, what I call laws of nuclear economics, and this goes to why the fundamentals of why this there's no doubt that nuclear energy can't be a climate solution. But to start with, nuclear projects are extremely expensive, and cost increases and delays are expected from the start. But the way they get these things going is that the projects had to appear to be economical when they begin. So they always use unrealistically low cost estimates to get projects approved. But then the cost overruns and the delays quickly mount up, and they take a long time to build, which means that essentially the utilities can't get financing to build nuclear reactors unless the states allow them to start charging customers for the cost of that before they're charge them for the cost of it while they're being built, which is not the way that utilities are usually allowed to do business. But the reality is that governments don't let utilities go bankrupt except in really extreme cases. And some of those have involved nuclear power plants. But that means that cover-ups are an attractive alternative to truth. And so we've seen in cases, in cover-ups and fraud involving nuclear projects all along. And the reality is also that the timeline for these projects to fail outlasts election cycles. So the people that allow the elected officials and public service commissioners who allow these projects to happen, give them those approvals, never face the consequences of those decisions. But the reality is that ratepayers and taxpayers, we have to pay our bills. And so the projects are always set up in a way that no matter how expensive these projects are, and no matter how uneconomical they are, that basically, families, households, ordinary people, and small businesses are going to be the ones that have to pay the bill. And that's really, I think, where we have to sort of, cut off the way that they're getting their money.
Thanks, Tim.
Yep.
Okay, now if Anne could turn on your video. I've known Anne for, that's not Anne, but that's Anne. So I've known Anne about 40 years. We were involved with an anti-nuclear group way back in the early 80s, and she has been she's involved with Don't Waste New York. Unfortunately, in New York, there's a big effort by the governor to make a big push on nuclear power. They just directed the New York Power Authority to build nuclear power plants. Anne has worked for national and statewide environmental organizations, such as with Lois Gibb for over 30 years, and has done organizing and advocacy on environmental health issues, such as toxic waste, Superfund sites, radioactive waste sites, green purchasing, pollution prevention, labor and environmental justice, zero waste, sludge, and in her free time, nuclear power. So take it away, Anne.
Thanks, Mark. Well, I'm going to give a brief overview of what we're dealing with in New York and lessons learned. Basically, our governor, Kathy Hochul, and there she is etched on a nuclear power plant, thanks to Gary Michael, Don't Waste New York, with her backwards thinking, has been aggressively pursuing nuclear power. But we're not going to get fooled again. So basically, I'll start with the most alarming information, most useful information that I hope that you will pass on. According to 3 whistleblowers in state agencies and the state authority, last year, Governor Hochul contacted the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, NYSERDA, and said, do a financial assessment on these advanced nuclear technologies. And they did an in-depth financial assessment report. The whistleblowers told us that the concepts were to look at New York State building up to 10 small modular nuclear reactors, or SMRs, at about $8 billion each. And New York State government would cover, and the ratepayers and taxpayers, would cover 20 to 50% of that $80 billion expense. The findings, and they looked at worst case scenario to best case scenario, and the findings were astronomical cost to ratepayers and taxpayers, enormous liability risk to the state. The recommendation to Governor Hochul was New York State should not pursue nuclear, as it is not fiscally responsible, and taxpayers and ratepayers will be on the hook for tens of billions of dollars. This was taken to the governor by Doreen Harris, the head of NYSERDA, and the governor rejected the recommendation and turned around and said, find the money, we are pursuing nuclear power. Meanwhile, in our state, we are not on track to meet our 2019 Climate Act law in terms of renewable energy goals. We're way behind, 6 years or more behind. And in terms of greenhouse gas emission reduction goals, we're way, way behind. And we also have a severe lack of funding for our Climate Act implementation. Her aggressive pursuit of nuclear power, just quickly, is earlier this year, NYSERDA, again, the authority, New York State was the lead in creating a 10-state consortium to promote advanced nuclear. And there's a list of the other states that are part of that consortium. And then NYSERDA started a 2-year process, advanced nuclear master plan process, to look at the job growth, et cetera, on the assumption that nuclear would be approved. No question, no assessment. And Governor Hochul superseded that last month by ordering her New York Power Authority to construct 1 gigawatt of new nuclear power capacity. There's other ways that they're pushing nuclear. The Public Service Commission, for instance, is recommending that advanced nuclear be added to the definition of zero emissions. There's a state energy master plan that's going to reportedly come out soon, focusing on gas and nuclear. And we have 8 counties and Republican legislators volunteering to host a nuclear plant so far. The most further along is unfortunately in where Tim Judson lives in Oswego County, where there's an existing site with 3 reactors run by Constellation, and the Micron computer chip facility in Syracuse, huge energy demand, is working with Constellation and NYSERDA and the Empire Economic Development Agency to pursue nuclear. Starting back at the beginning, how we got here. 1959, Governor Nelson Rockefeller created the Office of New York Atomic Development, the precursor to NYSERDA, and aggressively advocated for the first reactor in our state to be sited 24 miles north of New York City. That started Indian Point Unit 1 in 1962, and then 6 more reactors came after that, ending in 1988. Throughout this whole process, from 1959 to today, there has never, ever been on a federal or state level evidence-based assessment of the economic impact on ratepayers and taxpayers, comprehensive in terms of taking into account waste storage costs, the liability and the accident risks to residents and the state, the cost and risks of storing long-lived waste, and the releases posing health risks to nearby communities. Never been conducted. Here's a map showing the 7 reactors in New York State. Of course, the 3 at Indian Point, thankfully, are shut down. And here's from David Schlissel, who's a really great financial energy analyst. And this is a snapshot from the National Energy Technology Laboratory of the 2030 and 2050 projected cost per megawatt hour. You can see nuclear by 2050, 187 to 200. Whereas wind, solar with storage, solar and wind on land is 128 to 34 in 2050. So it's not rocket science. Nuclear reactors and SMRs will be much more expensive than renewables. But what has always been left out of the nuclear cost calculations, and what we're going to be focusing on with our state officials and with our campaign, is the cost of storing nuclear waste for 14 billion years, because uranium-235, one of the main waste components, has a half-life of 700 million years. So that's times 20 for hazardous life, is 14 billion years. Right now, the ratepayers are paying $35 million a year for the 7 reactors to store their 5,000 metric tons of high-level waste. And that does not include future costs to improve those on-site storage facilities from flooding on the Hudson River, for instance, where Indian Point reactor storage is, and extreme weather conditions from climate crisis like hurricanes. The future cost scenarios, if you play that out, are $17.5 billion over the next 500 years to store the existing waste we have. Now on to health and environmental health. Dr. John Goffman, who I had the pleasure of working with many, many years ago, Manhattan Project scientist and the father of the anti-nuclear movement, has pointed out quite compellingly that it's not a question anymore. Radiation produces cancer. Any increased exposure to radiation causes an increased risk to cancer. Department of Health agrees with that. World Health Organization agrees with that. The evidence is good all the way down to the lowest doses. So, the beginning of his quote, licensing a nuclear power plant is, in my view, licensing random, premeditated murder. And in our state, we have the possibility, as in any other state, the costs in terms of health, in terms of environmental damage, and in terms of cost of cleanup of possible off-site pollution. Our state conducts annual tests for radionuclides in deer, fish, and milk supplies because the radionuclides that come out of the stack emissions land on the grass, the cows eat the grass, and so they test for strontium-90 in the cows. And there are 60 years of test results for the annual testing, which has never been analyzed. On top of that, we have, thanks to a very forward-thinking Department of Health radiation surveillance director, who in 1959 conducted, before the first Indian Point reactor started, a baseline study, an ecosystem monitoring study, 20-mile radius around Indian Point. They tested the thyroid of rabbits. They tested fish, wildlife, cows, soil, sediment, air, water. It's an incredible baseline study, probably the only study that we know of in the world. And so what we need, what is any epidemiologist, any environmental science investigator would say, what we desperately need is for this study to be replicated and compared to that 1959 baseline study to see if there has been an increase in radioactive contamination and toxic chemical contamination since that study was done in 1959, since those 3 reactors operated for over 60 years. Another part that's never been cost calculation, oh, thanks, Rachel, is the corporate welfare that Tim mentioned. In New York, it's $28 billion in subsidies and bailouts. And then we have the cost of nuclear reactor accidents. 1.5% of all reactors has had a partial or significant core meltdown, which is a hugely high figure, 1.5%. 1950s, when nuclear reactors were first proposed, insurance companies did not want to insure them because of the major accident risks. And so they passed a law called the Price-Anderson Act to cap the liability. $660 million per reactor is the cap. Fukushima, up to $213 billion per reactor for the containment, remediation, or cleanup. So there's a huge gap there, the cost of a nuclear reactor accident. Now with the SMRs, the United Nations is saying it's poor economic and technical feasibility. Our Climate Action Council in New York has found nuclear too expensive and slow. And as Tim mentioned, these SMRs create up to 30 times more radioactive waste per unit of electricity, according to the National Academy of Science. So they're just a no-go. And they also require government welfare. This is a great expression here. First of a kind, FOAC, financing with government funding, is needed to de-risk the projects because the banks and corporations don't want to invest. And a recent study found that, of course, nuclear power plants with their specific risk profile are largely only bankable with government de-risking the investment and passing on that risk to taxpayers and ratepayers. So it's clear that nuclear seriously undermines transition to renewable energy, stealing resources to advance renewable energy and battery storage, unacceptably high risks. And so what we're doing in New York is we are pushing 2 campaigns. One is for fiscal accountability, that NYSERDA financial assessment report that the whistleblowers told us about that we have not been able to get through Freedom of Information requests. We're going to push our state controller to replicate that financial audit and prove that nuclear is not only deadly and dangerous, but it's uneconomical. And at the same time, pushing for a moratorium on any activities on nuclear. We're also going to push for the implementation of our 5-year-old Climate Act with a step-by-step renewable energy plan of action to show how we can meet our 2030, 2040, 2050 goals with solar power, wind power, battery storage, and reducing energy demand through things like geothermal heat pumps. We're also going to require annual actions and financing in this plan of action and public accountability measures. So that's our snapshot of where we are in New York, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Anne.
And our final speaker, and I should say after our final speaker, we'll be taking questions. Rachel Bratton, who's been helping us with the time, will help us also with the questions. If you can put your questions, I've seen some questions already in the chat function. But Elizabeth Beecher is a tribal member of Laguna Pueblo. She's also Agla Lakota and Kickapoo. She's a peacemaker and poet, a keeper of the seven generations. She will share her personal experiences, which led her into anti-nuclear activism, and share what she has learned about our collective people's power and that power behind the power we were all up against. Elizabeth.
Am I on?
You are on.
Can you see me?
We can see you
Okay,
and
good, because
hear
I'm on
you.
my iPhone. It's just okay. So there's no slideshow from me. But whether for weapons or electricity, nuclear energy comes from uranium. And nuclear from the ground up and beyond is now a big global mess. And I believe this issue began in New Mexico and must end where it began. Yes, 11 years ago, I returned to New Mexico for the 8th time, but this is the longest time I've been here. As I was going through community college, I would commute out to Powati, one of the villages of Laguna. The Powati is also home to the Jack Pile Mine, I found out later, not while I was there, one of the largest open uranium mines in the world, actually. But as I was taking care of my uncle, I began being paid as his official home health care giver through an agency that assisted all those radiated by the federal government intentionally, simply because the people that worked for the government during those times, they didn't know. Like my uncle, he was a uranium miner. And 3 months before I returned home to New Mexico and out in Laguna area, my aunt, my mom's oldest sister, who he was married to, had passed away from various cancers. She was a uranium miner. My uncle, I mean, nobody really talked about it, but along the way, over 3 years of helping to care for him, he would tell stories. And one of them was when he was a child, there was a fresh stream of water that would cascade out of the village and over some old rocks formation that took thousands of years to make. The water created a pool in the first level, like a little swimming pool, cascaded down to the next one, another deeper swimming pool, and further down, another level of a swimming pool for the older kids, then cascaded off down below into the ground, creating like a pond, and would stream off into another water source. And as we were coming into the village when he's telling the story, I said, "Uncle, is that where it was?" He said, "Yes." The tribal elders told them to stop because they were trying to reach where the largest cache of the yellow cake was right under the village. So you could see where the destroyers, I call them the destroyers, with the machines came and just scooped the side, took down those pools, those formations that took thousands of years to be made. And they were trying to get under the village to finally the part of the village was like an overhang. And the elders told them to stop, because they would have cleaned out underneath the whole village and it would have collapsed. But when that happened, Uncle said the water stopped running. They took the water away and they started mining. And I looked at that. To me, it just seemed so unreal to hear his stories, but to actually see those sites where he grew up as a child, And also, whenever I come into the village, I was wondering why there was always a metallic taste on my tongue. Because you come into the village, that's where the jack palm mine was on the right. When they were finished, they tried to cover it, make it look like a mesa again, but it doesn't look like a mesa. It looks kind of weird, And one time, Uncle said that they were all working in the jack pile mine there, And they were having lunch over the yellow cake, just wearing their dungarees and shirt. He emphasized that because that day, there was a day when their supervisors were going to come out and visit them. And he said they walked up in these space suits. They looked like they were on the moon. And he said they started laughing. And they asked, "Why are you wearing those?" And they didn't say anything. They just kind of asked them questions, how everything was going and so on. And then they left. And no one told them, my uncle and everyone, why they were wearing the suits or that it was dangerous what they were doing, you know. And no one told me to not pick the wild tea along the way. No one talked about it, you know, but there were stories added up. But really, my eyes were opened after I finished community college. I went on to UNM and as an English major and peace studies minor. One of the classes I took was nuclear New Mexico. And that's when my eyes were open. And a lot of what was happening, the Trinity Downwinders, Tewas Women United, Lanel, Church Rock spill, and then Powati. I learned more about the village in that course and what happened there than when I was living there for 3 years taking care of my uncle. And by that point, the tribe had moved me back in Albuquerque, the studio where I'm talking to you now to start you, because I was starting at UNM. But I tell you what, the field trips we took in that class were down to the Trinity Downwinder area where the big boy or fat boy was ignited, unbeknownst to the people who lived there. Just went off while everybody was sleeping. And it was it was the largest explosion, bigger than the one the United States dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I learned that. And I don't want to start crying. But anyway, we took a lot of field trips and I learned much. And eventually I joined DNA, Demand Nuclear Abolition, as one of the core group members. And that began that started from my professor who taught that course I took, you know, in women's studies. And we're all volunteers in DNA. We're collectives striving to protect New Mexico from all things nuclear through education, activism, and art. And what I learned after I graduated from UNM in December 2022, in 2023, DNA, we were active along with many grassroots organizations, including the 19 Pueblo Council of Governors, you know, to get SB 53 passed. It was my first experience of being around at the Roundhouse and watching all these representatives and senators and how it was just so bureaucratic and making decisions quickly on issues that affected generations for thousands of years and done in such a short time. And that alarmed me. And to also hear certain lawmakers and ones that pass these things, I was shocked. I'm like, they don't belong here they don't know what they're doing. They don't know anything about nuclear energy. It was a rude awakening, you know. But I learned much during that time. And SB 53 passed. It took 6 years to pass, apparently, and I happened to be there when it passed. And what that does is it prohibited the storage of disposal of high-level radioactive waste in the state until two conditions are met. The state explicitly consents to it, and the federal government has established a permanent underground repository for such a waste, and to expand the scope and duties of a task force to investigate impacts of nuclear waste disposed on New Mexico. And we didn't want it here. And that stopped Holtec from bringing all the nuclear waste core cylinders from the power companies, the nuclear power companies, which at that point it's clean, so-called clean, but not really. It doesn't emit the emissions for global, like those emissions, but it still kind of radiates, and the waste that comes out of there is by that time mutated to the point of an extreme danger where nobody wants it, and neither does New Mexico, neither does Texas. We are in for the push of a lifetime, because what I saw with the lawmakers and all that were happening was the push was behind the nuclear anything is the military industrial complex. And we're up against the big boys, but to tell you, our little group and other groups are all volunteers and nonprofits. The reason why that bill passed is because we all united together as one voice and we pushed. And now with this new administration, we have to unite globally. We have to unite in the United States, all of us as a collective, and push. Because together, we can push that steel gray mountain and flatten it into a plain of flowers. We can do this and prepare the way for future generations. We are the seventh generation. We right now, we are responsible for those not yet born, the parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents who are not yet here. And those now who are too little, babies and so on, who cannot speak for themselves. We are the voice for the voiceless. Just as our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents before us prepared for us to be here now. We are all keepers of the seventh generation. And it's more important for policymakers and lawmakers and so-called leadership, not just in the United States, but in the world, the global world, to think and make decisions from here, the heart of love. Not here, that's a tool of the boss. Seventh generation is where the evolution of the human being is. We don't have time to morph into a new species. No. Our evolution is the heart of love. Only together can we turn everything around for a new future. A new global future. That's where it's at. And what I learned from this whole political process is so bureaucratic, is that these serious issues can't be addressed from a partisan perspective. We need a new system. We need a new system. We need a new way of being. We need a collective of all these brainiacs, these ones that, like the scientists, all those who want to blast off to the moon and wherever. Keep your butts home. Clean up this mess. It's time to all work together. It's time to do this together as one and remember who we are. Not this man-made world that's an illusion, but to remember our responsibility amongst the cosmos for Mother Earth, our living, loving, sentient celestial being. She's our home. We're all indigenous to her. We've just been disconnected. The indigenous ones that are still connected to their lands, wherever they may be around the world, and still in communication with Mother Earth and the celestials, we must follow their lead. We must bring them into the place to help us remember what to do and where to go.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Yes? Am I done?
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Very good.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We're now going to open the thing up to questions. And as I mentioned, Rachel's going to help us with that part. Let me get everybody in here. It'll take me a few minutes. I did see there was one question, a couple questions about decommissioning costs, and somebody gave an example of New Hampshire split it between shareholders and ratepayers. Could people maybe go through and explain how that works on a regular basis?
Well, the way that it has worked up to now is that utilities who built the reactors got approval from their state utility commissions to charge the ratepayers to pay into a trust fund to pay for the eventual decommissioning. And and that's been the case as far as I know in every state with every nuclear plant, is that the ratepayers are the ones that are paying the costs. And even, if the shareholders are putting in whatever money the shareholders of a company has comes from the ratepayers anyway. So it's always us paying. What they do is they put the money into a trust fund, and just like the Social Security trust fund or a pension trust fund, it's invested and it's supposed to grow over time. But there's been malfeasance where companies have dipped into the decommissioning funds, when they're not supposed to, where they've underestimated how much is supposed to be in there. But the reality is that decommissioning is generally either always cost more than expected, or they've cut corners on the decommissioning and basically left a mess.
Yeah, just one point on that on decommissioning. For instance, New York State is an agreement state, so they implement the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's standards on cleanup, et cetera. And we looked at the Indian Point remediation investigation plan, where those 3 reactors operated for 60 years. And it's frightening what they're not testing, what they're not investigating. And they're using a cleanup standard that would allow, after the cleanup, it would result in 1 in 500 people getting cancer who lived on that facility, lived on that property. So that's another way in terms of cutting corners, leaving a heavily polluted property and legitimizing it.
Another question I saw, and maybe Rachel has one, is what is the best way, two-part question. What is the best way to debunk arguments about fusion as opposed to fission? And then also, what about thorium?
I mean, happy to talk about both those things, but I'll also give anyone else a chance to talk about it as well. So fusion is, it's the technology that's always 30 years away. The people have been doing research on fusion power for generations. There's a lot of talk and a lot of, sort of venture capital startup companies that are working on fusion now. But the reality is it's a technology that's nowhere close to being viable for producing anything of value to society. And the other myth about fusion is that it doesn't produce radioactive waste, when in fact it does. And every fusion reactor that I'm aware of uses as fuel for the fusion reaction large amounts of tritium, which is a radioactive form of hydrogen, which is extremely dangerous to human health and doesn't exist in the environment in the quantities that would be needed to run fusion power plants. And so they'd have to be breeding tritium through, which is again requiring nuclear energy and producing radioactive waste. So thorium is a similar story from a different angle, which is that thorium itself doesn't actually produce a nuclear chain reaction. Thorium is just more abundant in the environment than uranium is. And so the whole concept of a thorium reactor is to basically breed it by putting thorium near another nuclear chain reaction to turn the thorium into uranium-233, which is extremely fissile, extremely radioactive, and dangerous. But in order to make a thorium industry viable, you'd have to run a regular nuclear industry for several decades to produce enough nuclear waste to basically be able to make the thorium. It's a completely infeasible concept. And even India, which has the most evolved sort of plan for a thorium industry, um, wouldn't be able to start a thorium power industry for 60 years because of the steps they'd have to go through in order to make it possible. So it's really a pipe dream that's been sold to people as though it's a magical solution. The same way all nuclear technologies have been sold to people as though there's some magical solution, and all they are is a big source of pollution and danger.
So, in reading the questions, comments in the chat, there were a couple of overarching themes that I found. People want to know about specific elected officials and like where they stand, or people who are running, for certain offices that are key offices. And people are talking about certain geographical areas. And I think a good question to ask to answer a lot of these questions at one time would be, what geographical areas are most important to be focusing our energy on in this issue? And are there specific elected officials that you want to make sure get in or don't get in, that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, I think I would start with the governors and the state legislators in those 10 states in the New York state-led 10-state consortium. I'll put them in the chat. New York, and what we understand is New York and Wyoming are moving further along, but this is just, rumors. But what's frightening is that, we have 3 government whistleblowers telling us that this advanced nuclear is insane, astronomical cost, and it's a huge cover up by our governor. So we're gonna we'd love to work with folks in other states in the 10-state consortium.
And then, so there was some in the chat about warheads to windmills, and also about demand nuclear abolition, I guess. One of you spoke about that DNA. Are there other organizations besides those 2 that you would recommend folks try to get plugged into?
Oh, am I on?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, there's organizations that are like not just in our state, but throughout the United States and globally. But here in New Mexico, I think is a major focus because that's where the nuclear issue began, the Manhattan Project. And we don't need any more new nuclear weapons. But Tewa Women's United, they're an excellent source. You can find them. And the Trinity Downwinders Consortium. RICA was recently passed. It's within the extension of it, RICA, the Compensation Act. And the Trinity Downwinders have been fighting this for decades because the radiation affects, the DNA, literally, and is generational. Okay. And so I would notify, reach out to them, Tina Cordova, wonderful speaker and knowledgeable. I mean, there's so many people. Oh, in the church out there in the Church Rock spill, the Navajo Nations. There's just so many sites. I'm sorry, I'm not, I don't have that access to like send you these links. I'll have to go through my notes. But just you can find them and then ask these other organizations that I shared with you just now, and they can expand upon that. But right now we've got thousands of over 1,000 abandoned uranium mines that have not been cleaned up. We got a big mess. Oh, yucca. There you go. We have the youth and oh, that's an excellent one. The youth that began in started their movement, an organization called Yucca. I forget what the acronyms mean, but it's YUCCA, and they're based in Santa Fe, and I hear they're expanding in other states. The youth movement. We need to back the youth. So important, you know. I want to speak to all those old hippies that are not dead yet. Come on, we can do it. I don't care. Bring your walker, wheelchairs, and we'll just make a wall right between the youth and the guns, because those guns are aimed at the wrong people. We shouldn't aim guns anyway, because war is for profit of a few at the expense of innocent life. This is Wall Street and profiteers behind everything. I call them the destroyers because they are. But yeah, just check out organizations. They're everywhere, but the youth organizations that are, fighting for climate change, just let's back them. Let's support them. Mm.
Yeah, and I would just add that, in addition to all of the groups in, New Mexico and the Southwest that Elizabeth, just mentioned, there's grassroots groups all over the country that are fighting, reactors and, and nuclear waste sites and uranium mining, probably wherever you happen to be. And, NEARS can put you in contact with, with an organization in your area, if you just reach out to us.
Well, there's been kind of a thread of questions about efficiency and reducing use of energy that I think also ties in maybe with like the AI data centers. AI, if not everyone knows, AI is using an astronomical amount of energy. It's really difficult to actually describe how much energy AI is using. And I know some AI centers are being erected near, what is it, the water, what's it called? Well, anyway, different kinds of power plants, including coal, actually, too. But and this is happening in Minnesota, my own state as well, and they're going up frequently here. And they're actually getting away with fewer environmental testings and stuff. Anyway, the question is about the data centers being built alongside nuclear.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say about this, but the reality is that the nuclear energy is not a solution for data centers and artificial intelligence any more than it is for climate change. And I have in my slide deck there are slides about that. Um, but I think one of the things to sort of I think people sort of need to grapple with is that this isn't, I mean, this whole thing about AI seems like it's just sort of the world gone mad. But I think from what I've sort of from nuclear industry conferences that I've been at where this has been talked about extensively, I think the important thing to understand about the mindset that is driving all of this is that people are viewing artificial intelligence essentially as the next nuclear weapons race. That they view these things as omniscient, omnipotent machines that are vital to national security, and therefore there is a direct connection between the mindset around AI and the mindset that has driven the nuclear industry for the last 80 years. And so, I think that the way that they're marrying these things is very much, within the idea of basically a police state and, and the nuclear weapons complex. And so I think we need to be really concerned about the priority that's going to be given to that over our communities, over our health, over our environment, and over anything that we care about.
One thing I'll add, and I think Tim explained it better than I could, but you're also looking at cryptocurrency, particularly proof of work, Bitcoin. That's been a big issue in New York, in particular. And Ann mentioned previously, the Micron microchip company getting billions of dollars of subsidies to go build in Syracuse. And they're saying, well, if you don't give us a nuclear power plant to deal with us, we're going to go build a fossil fuel plant. And so all these things, artificial intelligence, data centers, cryptocurrency, are being used to increase the demand. And, the nuclear industry is just better, lobbyists and making more campaign contributions than the solar and wind industry is.
Yes, yes. But as Elizabeth said, people power will win out. And we have the facts on our side, and we have people power. And we have this incredible secret report, and we want to get word out there. I think every state controller should be doing an audit on the costs of advanced nuclear technologies. Every single state controller.
And I also just wanted to mention, I know people are talking about the issue of abolition of nuclear power, abolition of nuclear weapons. There is the international campaign against nuclear, which is pushing for nuclear abolition, mainly on nuclear weapons. Of course, the big opponent is the United States. And this has been going on for years, and the United States continues to oppose nuclear disarmament. And then, of course, the whole situation right now with Iran and Israel, and then also between Pakistan and India. It's insanity, but we're sort of losing that particular fight at the moment.
Oh, yeah. Patricia's had her hand up for a while, Mark.
I know we try to get written questions.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
So I was just going to say, I see that your hand is raised, Patricia. There's one more question before I would call on, because we were looking at chat questions first. But the question is about small modular nuclear reactors and kind of where they stand as far as feasibility and cost and so on.
Sure. So SMRs, we sort of sometimes call them supposedly mythical reactors. They don't actually exist at this point. There's a lot of hype about SMRs, but in fact, in the US, there's none of these reactors have had their designs fully approved yet. They haven't been built anywhere in the world outside of a couple of one-off reactors that are sort of called small modular reactors in China and Russia. Um, but the reality is, and from one of the slides that I showed you, is that they are, even if they started construction today, they would be even more expensive than the large reactors that we already know are infeasible. So, in fact, by the time Biden sort of left office, the federal government had actually started to turn away from the idea of SMRs because they knew this was coming. And so they had gone back to promoting large reactors, um, you know, because they couldn't imagine not supporting nuclear energy some way. But the reality is that, that whether it's a small modular reactor, a micro reactor, an advanced reactor, or a regular, large, huge reactor, it's not a solution to anything. And we need to move away from it as fast as possible, just like we do with fossil fuels.
And we do try to end around 9:10, 9:15 or so.
Okay.
It's 9:07, and we try to give each of the speakers about 2 minutes for a closing statement.
That's true. Should we let Patricia ask her question?
You're the co-chair.
Okay. I'm going to let Patricia go.
Okay, I have worked energy issues a lot, and one of the best ways to work energy issues and what's included in rates and what businesses can survive is by participating in rate cases before the commissions and learning how to work those. because they have to make reasonably prudent decisions, and they can get things kicked out when there are no reasonably prudent decisions being made in what is included in the rates. What I did, and at that time I was an advocate with a major national nonprofit, is I worked with the local public interest law firms that were working on energy and worked the rate cases. And we got nuclear kicked out even before I got involved with SAFE. And what we did is that we made sure, and the attorney made sure, that they started talking about how much it was going to cost to decommission, how much it was going to cost to do storage, so that it made it very difficult to include them in the rates. And it and also in the rate of return. What was included in the rate of return? Did they include subsidies or not? As well as splitting the costs with ratepayers. It's been a while since I've been away, but I can tell you it is an effective strategy. Right now, all I've been working on has been the nuclear issues, especially as related to waste. And SAFE was very much involved, and DNA was certainly a partner in all of that, in all of what we did at the legislature. But we also work with national organizations to get information and to make sure we were on track. But those rate cases, if you don't work the rate cases, you're gonna be drowned by the nuclear companies.
Thank you, Patricia.
So can we do closing statements and maybe go in reverse order? So we'll start with Elizabeth and then Ann and then Tim, and we'll give Rachel the final closing statement.
Oh, this is a final statement?
Final statement.
2 minutes.
Okay. Remember who you are. It's time to return home to the garden. That is based in love. In everything that we do, so important now to focus on love, because there are too many that do not have a heart of love, and they're in high places and behind the power that we don't see. So love can move that big flat steel mountain into a plain of flowers. We can do this together. It's the only way.
Ann?
Oh, thanks, Elizabeth. Well, I guess I'll end by saying, we in New York are really working hard to set a national precedent, which we have done in the past. We have the best funded and with the most health protective cleanup standards state Superfund in the country, brownfield cleanup program. We were the first state to deal with acid rain, coal plants, et cetera. So we've been a first in the nation, along with California, on a lot of environmental laws. And we're very focused on the people leading the leaders to get the moratorium on advanced nuclear, to get a controller audit or the release of the secret report, and to have a step-by-step plan of action on how renewable energy, battery storage, energy efficiency, geothermal heat pumps can meet our Climate Act goals over the next 30 years without nuclear. And any suggestions that people have in terms of energy economics firms that could do this plan of action, any suggestions in terms of other financial studies that have been done on nuclear, please send me an email. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Tim?
Yeah, and I would just add that, we are really in a fight for our lives and for the future generations, and which is being squandered by powerful corporations that don't have any of our interests at heart. And we need to build a much more powerful grassroots movement to take our power back and to not let that happen. So, so I think we need to think to to Anne's point and to Elizabeth's point, we need to build a unified movement, to phase out dirty energy, whether it's nuclear or fossil fuels or, whatever else, to save our lives and to save the future.
And Rachel, you got any final words for us? Besides thanking all our wonderful speakers and all the wonderful people who participated, and we will be sending out a copy of the video, and if the speakers, particularly Tim and Ann, wanted to share their slides, we can also include that for people.
Okay, so I'm just going to list some of as many of the orgs that I have collected now that people have put in the chat and also named in the webinar. Warheads to Windmills, Demand Nuclear Abolition, DNA, Trinity Downwinders Consortium, Yucca, YUCCA, SAFE, Southwest Alliance for a Safe Environment, MACE, Multicultural Alliance for a Safe Environment, and Rocky Mountain Research Institute. Now, I want to remind everyone that the reason nuclear is even a conversation point in the first place is because we're using way too much energy, right? If we decrease our energy usage, and I'm not just talking about individuals, although individuals make a big difference, but fighting for energy efficiency in all kinds of ways, we wouldn't even need to be considering the topic, right? Nobody would. And one of the biggest current increases in energy use is the use of AI. And it's on our phones, it's on our computers when we make a search. And I know that there are organizations like EcoAction where it's a nonprofit organization. It doesn't use AI, and you can do a search without AI using EcoAction. And all the money that EcoAction gets from your searches goes towards habitat restoration projects from around the world.
Could you spell that for us in the chat, Rachel?
Yep. Oh, it's ECOSIA, and I'll put it in the chat too.
Thank you.
Somebody already put it in.
And it's really easy. You literally go to the website and push a button, and it will be on your computer, and you'll just start using EcoAction instead of, your typical search thing. And then I wanted to remind our members, next week, Monday, we'll have our membership meeting. And I believe next month we're planning to, instead of having a webinar, we're going to be talking about our, is it the Green New Deal? Talking about just having meetings to update things. Am I getting that right, Mark? Sound right?
So are we done?
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think so. Thank you.